name is Aftan Vander, and I am a technical support representative here at Integrated DNA Technologies. Today we'll be discussing situations in which you need to customize PCR or qPCR primer designs. I will give some live demonstrations regarding these customization scenarios as well. We'll spend a lot of time discussing the recently redesigned and revamped PrimerQuest tool to provide even better designs for PCR, qPCR, sequencing, and other customized design applications. So before we get started, I wanted to give you some background information on the people presenting today's webinar, as well as the general webinar format. So for the third time, here's my name, Aftan Vander, and I'm tech support here at IDT. Here's the picture you saw in the webinar registration, as well as another one. As you can see from my Hawkeye sticker and t-shirt, I went to the University of Iowa and graduated with a Bachelor's of Science in Cell and Developmental Biology. IDT became my second home after graduation, and I've been here ever since. Over the years, my position encompasses a little bit of everything, and I like to consider myself IDT's jack of all trades. Next, we have today's moderator. Our moderator today is Dr. Hans Packer. Dr. Packer has his PhD from the neuroscience program at the University of Iowa, where he studied genetic and molecular mechanisms of schizophrenia and other psychiatric illnesses. Dr. Packer is currently a scientific writer at IDT, a regular contributor to the Decoded newsletter, as well as scientific content for the IDT website. Hans also organizes, helps produce, and moderates most of the webinars here at IDT. So the last thing before we get started is the format of today's webinar. For each section in the webinar, I will quickly discuss the agenda or overview, go over the topic, and then do a brief review of the topic before moving to the next section. We will stop for questions halfway through and at the end. The moderator will review these questions. We'll take as many as possible, and then we'll move on to the next section, or if it's the end, we'll be out of time. So the overall agenda for today's webinar, first we're going to start with some different primer design options that are offered free through the IDT website. Then I will introduce a tool designed to allow you to customize your PCR and qPCR assays. It's called the PrimerQuest Design tool, a highly popular PCR assay design tool provided free online by IDT. I'll go over basic usage of this tool and then move to some customized design parameters. Finally, after those parameters are discussed, we'll ask you to vote, as Hans mentioned. More information to come later, but these options include how to design assays using pre-existing primers, positioning primers to span exon junctions, how to avoid specific regions, and how to force the position of a primer's 5' or 3' end. Keep these options in mind during the first part of today's webinar so you know which options you are most interested in when it comes to the time where we poll you guys. So to get started, today we are going to focus on situations where you need to customize your PCR and qPCR assay designs. Like I mentioned in the previous slide, this could include designing probes for pre-existing primer sequences, avoid specific regions of the gene, or force your primer location, just to name a few. Design tools are important to primer design, but not all allow you to customize these kinds of things. IDT offers a variety of free online tools for oligo analysis, including several for primer design. If we switch to our IDT homepage, if we highlight the SciTools tab, this is where all of our free online SciTools are located on our website. For qPCR and PCR assay design, we actually have a couple of options available. If I go to this PCR dropdown, the qPCR dropdown, the first option is the PrimeTime tool, which is a library of pre-designed qPCR assays for human, mouse, and rat. For qPCR designs of other species, we would recommend using the next tool on this list here, the real-time PCR design tool. The real-time tool is designed to deliver primers that span exon junctions. The PrimerQuest tool, which we will be spending the most time with today, which is based on the Primer 3 engine design, is one of our most heavily used online SciTools. And it provides many opportunities to customize your primer design, which is why we'll be focusing on that one today. So let's get started with a brief introduction to the PrimerQuest tool. Like I mentioned, we recently revamped the tool, which included some back-end engine design as well as improving the user interface. So during this section, we'll discuss where we can find PrimerQuest, which I already kind of went over, some of its basic functions and designs, as well as navigating the results page. For the examples that I'll be doing live, these are the accession numbers that I'll be using in case you're wondering. I'm going to paste them from a different screen, but just so you know, those are the ones that I'm going to be using. So switching back to our live site, I'm just going to go ahead and select PrimerQuest from the Sci Tools drop-down. There are a couple ways to get to the PrimerQuest Home tool. I think that way is the easiest. So once we get to this page, the first thing that we would need to do to start a design is enter the sequence or transcript that we want to design against. The PrimerQuest tool actually has 3 different options. So this first option here is a manual sequence entry. So you can just paste your sequence directly into the text box. For this new version of the tool, we can do up to 50 designs at a time. And so if you want to paste 50 sequences in here, they do need to be in the FAFSA format. We can also download sequences directly from NCBI using a GenBank or an accession ID number. If you want to download up to 50 as the tool allows, these would need to be a comma-separated list. This is the one I'll demonstrate, so I'll show you that one in just a moment. The last and final option for entering your sequence is uploading them using an Excel file. We do have a template available here on the site. It's pretty similar to any other format on the IDT site in which the sequence name or the transcript name is in the first column and the actual contents of the sequence is in the second column. So I'm going to go ahead and grab these accession numbers and put them into this NCBI ID number box. Clicking Get Sequence will load those into this section here. If I scroll through, I can see that all of these are in there if I wanted to double check. You probably noticed that before I put these sequences in, these boxes down here were previously gray, which means I wouldn't have been able to click on them. My design wasn't ready yet. The tool wasn't ready. Once I do have sequences entered, these boxes turn orange, letting me know that we're ready to go. So these 3 orange buttons I like to refer to as our easy buttons. Pretty much once you have a sequence entered, if you want any of these 3 design options, you can just click on them and it'll immediately take you to the results page. No other steps needed. So this first box is just a general PCR. Second box is a probe-based qPCR, and the third box is an intercalating dye-based qPCR. So something like CyberGreen or EvaGreen. We'll go over this more in detail in the next section, but I just wanted to show you where these custom design parameters were in case you saw the button and were wondering what that was doing. But I'll cover that in more detail in the next section. So at this point, I'm not doing any custom manipulation. We're just showing you how this tool works. So I'm going to push qPCR to primers plus probe, and that'll get my design started here. So as you probably mentioned, we are doing a batch design, or you saw it. And so looking up here, if I do less than 20 assays at a time, those results do load as they're ready. If you do want to do between 20 and 50 designs, we will pop open a link that asks for your email address, and we'll email you a link when the results are ready. Clicking on the link will take you to this exact results page, but just in case it takes a little bit longer, since it is a larger design, we just get that email sent to you. To panel through these results, it's pretty similar to how NCBI functions for their batch designs. I can just panel through these in this drop-down. This main results page, this top section, shows you where the assays lay down in your transcript. So it has the length, and these green sections indicate where that set lies down. So clicking on these has the same functionality. I can select them and unselect them. From this main page, I can see the assay details for all of my sets at the same time. And off on this section to the right, I can see all the information about the primers, the probe, any length, TM, GC content, all of that important information. As you can also see, when I hover over any of these lines, I have the option to check the hairpin structure of the sequence or blast the sequence. Since we are doing this result or this design live from the tool, we don't have time to blast for cross-reactivity or check for SNP locations or anything like that, as it is trying to provide designs as fast as possible. So once you choose on a primer or an assay that you are comfortable with or you would like to order, then we would recommend manually blasting it to check for cross-reactivity after receiving the primer sequences. If you want to see any of the sequence information for these, you can just click View Assay Details. This will show you the sequences for the forward and reverse and the probe if you did do a probe-based design. It also shows you where exactly that lies on the transcript as well as all that sequence information. To get back to the results page, I can either click this results button here or click back to results. For my batch, it takes just a second to pop all those up again. The other thing that's really nice is we do have the option to export the assay information. So if I was logged into my account, there would be a button here that said download assay information. Since I did do a batch design of 14 at the same time, if I chose export with nothing selected, it would export all 5 sets for all 14 genes. Alternatively, if I only had 1 or 2 sets selected, it would only export the selected sets. If you are familiar with the old PrimerQuest tool, you may notice that in this updated version, we no longer show the primer penalty scores. There are a lot of good reasons we no longer show this or why they're displayed, but essentially the updates made to the tool have improved the designs significantly, and no quote-unquote bad assays should be displayed in the tool. Because of this, there's no longer really any use for these primer penalty scores, and so they're no longer shown. At this point, if I had the assay selected that I would like to order, I could select them and click Add Selected Assays to Cart. We're not going to go through that whole process, as it is a pretty standard ordering process, but that's how you would proceed from here with the PrimerQuest tool. All right, so some key introduction points for that PrimerQuest overview was the PrimerQuest design tool is based on the Primer 3 engine design. There's 3 methods of sequence entry, and we can do batch design for up to 50 sequences at a time. Clicking those orange easy buttons will quickly receive designs for the application of your choice. We recommend a blast of primer sequences to check for cross-reactivity. And View Assay Details will show the primer and probe sequences. So at this point, we're going to move to some of those custom design parameters, which I kind of touched on in the previous section. So we'll talk about some of the parameters we have available for customization on the IDT website, as well as where to find them in PrimerQuest. We'll also review some of the parameter presets that we have available, and then I'll demonstrate some actual live parameter manipulation. I'm going to hop back to the live tool here, and I'll just reset this page so we can get that parameter information shown. So like I mentioned, clicking the Show Custom Design Parameters shows all the parameters that we do have available. I'm going to quickly reset this to a single design. Okay. So as you can see, the parameters range from the number of results to return all the way to specifying custom design regions. Let's start with some of the parameter presets, which are located at the top here in this gray box. Toggling between the available options will adjust the parameters to our recommended settings for each application type. This is also helpful if you're ever wondering what the difference is between our design recommendations for qPCR versus PCR versus sequencing primers, etc. As a note, the probe parameters will not be shown unless the probe-based qPCR parameter preset is chosen. So if you saw when I switched right now, we just have primer criteria and amplicon criteria. Switching this to qPCR probe will repopulate the probe criteria in the parameter screen. Also, if you ever reach a point where you would like to reset the parameters back to our default values, simply re-click on one of these radio buttons and the parameters will all reset to the default conditions. Moving on to the actual parameters, I'll start at the top here and make my way down. Results to return will adjust the number of designs we return per gene or sequence entered. We default this to 5 for single and batch entry, but you can increase the results to return if you're doing one design at a time, up to 50 results. Vary primer location is a parameter we just added with this new tool update. This parameter tells the design engine how far the 3' position of one primer of one design must lie from the 3' position of the primer of another design. So basically, this increases the variability of where the results and inherently the assay lie on your gene of interest. We default this to a medium amount of variability, which is a distance of 7 base pairs. Off represents 0, medium is 3 or 4, off is 0, low is 4, medium is 7, and high is 14 bases. This can be adjusted individually for the forward and the reverse primer. Next is the reaction conditions section. These represent the concentrations that should be present in the actual PCR, qPCR, or sequencing reaction. We default the values based on some standard master mix conditions. A point to note is that the monovalent and divalent salt concentrations, which are shown as the magnesium and sodium concentrations there, significantly impacted the TM of a primer or probe sequence. For example, if I determine the TM of a primer using 0 for both of those salt concentrations, the calculated TM of the primer can be 5 to 10 degrees lower than the calculated TM when using actual reaction conditions, having those concentrations for the salts. Although PCR and qPCR are rather robust, incorrectly calculating the TM could result in inefficiencies in the reaction. Any of these values can be adjusted based on the actual values in your master mix prior to designing your assays, but we would always want to make sure that there is some sort of concentration, especially for those divalent salts. Next, moving to the primer and probe criteria. These allow you to adjust some of the most common parameters for any design tool, which is the TM, the GC content, and the primer size. The amplicon criteria simply determines the length of the amplicon you would like for your assay. For the remaining parameters, we'll discuss these further during some of our custom design scenarios, but I can quickly review some of these. The included and excluded regions essentially define where the primers or the assay can be designed or where they must avoid. A target region list allows you to define a region that primers must flank. This partial design input region allows you to design around pre-existing primer or probe sequences. Next is the overlap junction list, and this essentially allows you to denote exon junctions or regions that you need the primers to lay down on. Finally, the primer force location settings allow you to set the 5' or 3' position of the forward or reverse primer sequences. If you're ever unsure of what a parameter means, when you may have saw me do this earlier, you can simply click on the parameter name and this will show the definition for that specific parameter. Lastly, there are specific parameters that cannot be adjusted when doing a batch entry. These parameters will actually be grayed out. Essentially, the ones that cannot be adjusted are the results to return, which for batches we only do 5 at a time, as well as these custom target regions. If more customization is needed for a specific gene, we would recommend designing this sequence individually. So I'm going to show you a design where I do some quick parameter manipulation and show you how that works. So I already have the sequence entered that I need. I have my accession number entered here. And let's say for my specific experiment, I need to make some adjustments to the primer size, GC content, and the TM content that I think are more optimal for my reaction. So in this example, I'm just going to do qPCR, so I'll switch that, cyber-based. I want the primer size to be 18, so I'll move this down. I want the TM to be 70 degrees and the GC content to be at 25%. So I have all of these adjusted. I don't have to do anything else. I can simply click Get Assays. So at this point, the tool is telling me that it wasn't able to find any assays. And one other thing that we did update with this version of the tool was actually adding a table to show you the reasons why no assays were found. So if I look at this first column here, we can go over the way that this section reads. So for the forward primer, the tool had 15,000 possible forward primer designs. 14,000 of these fell outside the GC content range. And if you remember, I moved that parameter up or down to be 25%. So it's likely that 14,000 of these are above the parameter that I specified at 25%. 1,000 of the forward primers fell below the TM range that I specified, and I specified a pretty high TM of 70 degrees. 113 of these also had a long poly-X sequence. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit, but essentially it means that it was on a section that had 3 or more G's, C's, A's, or T's in a row. If I go through the reverse primer, same things apply. So essentially, as I can see in both of these columns, 0 of the forward or reverse primers met the design parameters that I have available. So at this point, it's telling me I may need to adjust some of my parameters. The nice thing about this is it's going to force me to kind of think about what sort of manipulation I did to the parameters to get to this point in the first place. So if I just think about the criteria that I specified, the higher the TM for a primer typically indicates a higher GC content and a longer length. So I pretty much asked the tool to do something that isn't really possible. It would be very, very hard for it to get a primer that has a TM of 75 with a length of only 18 and a GC content of 25. A primer at a length of 18 would need a very high GC content to get a TM. So it's not necessarily that the tool wasn't able to design something. I'm just kind of asking for something that isn't possible at this point. So after I thought about this a little bit, maybe I should try to increase my primer size, see if the tool is allowed or can give me something to work with if I relax these parameters a little bit. So adjusting that, I'll go ahead and click Get Assays again. And at this point, the tool was able to get me some results. If I look, it's not exactly what I specified. I did ask for a TM of 70 and a GC content of 25%. But those parameters are probably too stringent. If I do look at this assay, you know, it is pretty GC rich in certain regions. There are some repeats, and so it probably was pretty difficult for it to reduce the GC content all the way to 25% with that high TM, but the tool did do the best it could. So kind of keeping in mind what you're actually asking the tool to do when you manipulate those parameters is probably a good idea as well. So in addition to the parameters that we have available for adjustment, there are many more parameters utilized to provide the best primer design possible. And I wanted to talk about some of the more important ones that are in play behind the scenes. So first we have a parameter called Primer Max NGC. Essentially it means that for the last 5 bases on the 3' end of each primer, they can contain a maximum of 3 G or C bases total. Essentially, this parameter ensures the primer will strongly bind on the 3' end without causing too much secondary structure. The Poly X parameter that I kind of mentioned when I had those no results found basically ensures that poly base runs are restricted to 3 bases or less, so no more than 3 Gs, 3 As, 3 Cs, 3 Ts. The Pair Max Different TM parameter is set to 3. Essentially, this means that the TM of the forward and reverse primers cannot differ by more than 3 degrees. For most standard PCR or qPCR assays, we recommend that the forward primer and reverse primer have TMs as close together as possible. So this tool won't return any results where that pair differs by more than 3 degrees for their TM. We also have quite a few dimer checks for self-dimers as well as primer dimer formations, as well as on the 3' end. And these checks just basically ensure that there's low primer dimer values for your whole assay. Lastly, we make sure there are no G bases on the 5' end of the probe. Those G bases will partially quench most green or yellow dyes. So a couple key points for the custom design parameters before we move on. The parameter presets will show the settings we use for each design, and the probe criteria is not shown until a probe-based qPCR option is chosen. Clicking on a parameter name will show the definition, which I showed a few times. Some parameters cannot be adjusted when doing a batch design, so here's what that looks like when it's grayed out for doing a batch design. Parameters can be reset to defaults by re-clicking on a parameter preset. And other parameters work behind the scenes to try to produce the best primers possible for all of your design needs. So at this point, we'll move to some of those advanced customized design scenarios. As Hansen mentioned at the beginning, we're going to do a live poll to see which options you guys would like to see. We'll try to go over 2 if we have enough time. Here are the options. So it includes how to design assays using pre-existing primers, positioning primers to span exon junctions, how to avoid specific regions, so included versus excluded design regions, and how to force the position of a primer's 5' or 3' end. So at this point, I think hands will get that poll up, and we can also take any of the questions you guys have so far for the beginning of this section.
Okay, at this point you can see that it's switched to this poll, and when you click on it, it'll then return you back to the presentation screen. After about a minute, I'll just close the poll on its own, and that'll also return you to the presentation screen. But as soon as you click on one of those options, it'll take you back as well. So Aftan, while people are looking at that, can you just say a quick thing about, so they've got the information from their assay design, and can you just say why maybe that TM that they've got from their designed assay doesn't match what shows up on their spec sheet?
Absolutely. So for most of our design tools, all three that I mentioned for the prime time, real time, and the PrimerQuest tool, we do use default or some standard master mix conditions. So we usually use a magnesium concentration of 3 millimolar and a DNTP concentration of 0.8 millimolar. And like I had mentioned, those divalent salt concentrations significantly impact the TM. And the TM that you do see on the spec sheets, we don't use any divalent or monovalent salt concentrations to calculate those, just because we don't necessarily know what customers are using those for when they receive the spec sheet. So obviously when you're using the design tool, we can kind of infer that you're using them for PCR or qPCR. You'll be using a standard master mix. So we can kind of guess at those master mix conditions, default those a little bit to give you some more accurate designs. But when you do receive the spec sheets, we really have no idea what customers will be using those primers for, so we don't use those divalent salt concentrations to calculate the TM. So typically the TM you see on your spec sheet will differ than the TM you see on the design tool. To double check that, you can just hop into our oligo analyzer tool, input the sequence, use your default reaction conditions, and get an accurate reading of that TM.
Okay. I guess we can take a couple more questions here since we have some. So the next question that I have for you, when you showed the max GC ends, is that the same as a GC clamp?
It is not. It's a little bit different. So basically, a GC clamp relates to the number of G's and C's immediately on the 3' end of the primer. So if we specify a GC clamp, let's say we say it has to be 3, it forces or encourages those primers to end with 3 G's or C's in a row at the 3' end. So it would have like CCC, GGG, CGC, so on and so forth. From what we determined with some of our internal testing and validation, sometimes the clamp itself can lead to more off-target issues as the 3' ends become very sticky. So when we do have the G's and C's on that 3' end, as we know the polymerase extends off that 3' end, we actually see that it does reduce some of the specificity. So rather than forcing a specific GC clamp, we just limit the numbers of G's and C's within the last 5 bases. So basically, this encourages 2 or 3. It allows up to 3 so that we do have some increased specificity so that primer does hybridize to the template well without reducing the specificity. So it's kind of a balance between getting a good hybridization without allowing the primer to become unspecific and have some off-target effects.
Okay, here's a design question for you. So how can somebody design assays with degenerate primers?
With degenerate primers. We'll kind of talk about that if we go through that partial design input section. I can show you that in the design parameters section. But essentially, if you have degenerate primers that you want to work with, we're going to put them in this forward and reverse input region. If you're designing for one and want the other, so on and so forth, you would just put those degenerate bases within the primer sequence in there. One thing to note is that all the degenerate bases, the tool is just going to read as an N, which is A, C, G, or T. The rest of the forward or reverse primer sequence must be located somewhere on your original transcript. So if you enter a transcript in here that your forward or reverse primer does not lie down on, the tool is not able to design for that. So as long as the rest of the sequence, the sequences that, or the the bases that are not degenerate bases do lie down on that sequence, we should be able to design for the other part of your assay.
Okay, I have one more thing about just like the basic conditions that you input. So talking about
Okay.
salt concentrations, DNTP concentrations and such, the master mix composition for qPCR is usually not entirely known what's in it. So
Mm-hmm.
how does a person deal with that?
Some that is something that we've struggled with as well. Some people are, very willing to give up the information of what's exactly in their master mix, where sometimes it's more of a black box where you're not really sure what you're using. From all the ones that we've tested, we have tested a lot of master mixes. It ranges between 1.5 and 3 millimolar for this divalent salt concentration right here. Typically the monovalent doesn't really change much. It's usually 50 millimolar. The magnesium tends to be the only one that varies. So we just set it at 3. We usually recommend doing between 1.5 and 3. As long as you have something in there, your TM is going to be much closer to an actual TM than if you used 0, since all master mixes will have some sort of divalent salt concentration.
So is that so those were the factors that kind of went into determining what IDT picked as the default conditions that show up there?
Right.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. Let's move on to the poll here. We can get back to some of these other questions here in a little bit.
Okay.
So these are the results from our poll. So it looks like the first thing, the most popular thing, is forcing primer locations. And then after that, it's going to be denoting exon junctions, and we'll cover as many of these other ones as possible.
Perfect. Okay, so we'll start with forcing the position of the primers, 5' or 3' end. This one doesn't take very long, so maybe we will be able to get in a couple more examples. But essentially for this one, let me flip over my notes here. Essentially, the tool can force the 5' or 3' end of the forward or reverse primers. There's various situations where you would want the primer to start exactly at a location or end exactly at the location. For whatever reason, maybe you want to target a very specific region to amplify, but we do have the ability to actually tell the tool where that primer needs to start or end. So for this specific example, this is the accession number I'm going to use, and let's say for this one, I want the primer's 5' position for the forward primer to start at 100. Maybe I really want an amplicon from around base 100 to 250, 300 or so. So let's switch back over to this tool. I'm going to switch to a general PCR and reload with my correct accession number. So as you might have noticed, I can click enter, hit enter, or click get sequence. So the only thing I need to do from this point, I already have a parameter preset chosen. I told it that I want to do a general PCR, which gives me a wide range for that amplicon size. All I have to do at this point is just specify the start position or stop position. Typically, we wouldn't recommend probably doing more than 2 of these. Obviously, if you're specifying the 5' and 3' end of all of your forward and reverse, you already know the primer sequences. So we do want to give the tool a little bit to work with to try to provide the best designs possible. When we only specify one of these, it is able to work a little more. In this example, it can adjust the 3' end a little bit since it has some room to work with the primer size. It is able to choose a number of reverse primers. So once I have everything entered, I can just click Get Assays. So as you can see up here, all of these do start exactly at 100. The forward primer is pretty much the same for all of these assays, which is pretty typical. It either stops at 122 or 121. And then the reverse primer kind of has a range, so I do have a range of amplicons here. If I switch back, I could change it to having a reverse location. Say we can put that base pair 800, something of that nature, and we can do the exact opposite. So it kind of looks similar, but as we can see, these reverse primers are all stopping at base pair 800. Is there any specific questions about that section, Hans?
Let's see here. We have some questions specifically related to that.
Okay.
Not exactly. Here's a question for you, though. So this person's asking, Can you use PrimerQuest, and this is not specific to this section, but can you use PrimerQuest to design assays for genotyping? And if not, do we have some software that we can use for genotyping assays?
That's kind of a difficult question. It kind of depends what type of assay you prefer to have for a genotyping assay. So typically with genotyping assays, the reason you're using them is you want to differentiate between a SNP or a single nucleotide polymorphism. So a lot of times for genotyping assays, there's a couple of ways that you can distinguish between them. One way that you could possibly do that is force the 3' end of the primer to be exactly on that SNP. As you know, if the 3' position of a primer does not bind completely, it's pretty hard for the polymerase to be able to extend off there. And so if there's a SNP exactly at that 3' end, it should significantly reduce the efficiency of your assay. Sometimes there is a possibility that amplification would occur, though. So most of the time here at IDT, when we are designing genotyping assays, we actually use LNA primetime probes. For those of you who don't know about LNA, they're locked nucleic acids, and they will only bind to their specified target. So an LNA A base will only bind to a T base, LNA G only to a C base. So usually what we do in those cases is we'll design an assay that has a forward and reverse primer, and then it would have 2 probes. One probe would have a sequence for the wild type. The other probe would have the sequence of the mutant or that single nucleotide polymorphism sequence. And at the position of that SNP, you would have an LNA base. Typically, the probes have about 3 to 6 LNA bases, so it's a little bit of a shorter probe. But basically, you would have different dyes on each of those, and based on the amplification you see, the height of your 2 dyes in contrast to each other would be the way that you determine the amount of mutant versus wild type you have in your sequence. Unfortunately, there's not a really good way for our tools to locate those. It's pretty hard for them to find the SNP location. So typically we do a lot of those designs manually in-house. One thing that you can do is if you do know those SNP locations, you can simply design it in the way that I mentioned. But unfortunately, there's not a design tool that can kind of think through that process.
So we can just give them some contact information. They can contact the customer care people at the end. Okay.
Absolutely.
So let's see here. Let's move on to another question here. Let's see one more question. So how can we know if there are more SNPs in the amplicon and how to exclude them from the amplification sequence? And when I read this question, I was actually kind of thinking about maybe mentioning the assay libraries that we have.
Mm-hmm. So in this tool, as I mentioned when we were talking about the results, how we recommend blasting the sequences, this tool does not have the ability to check for SNPs either in the actual primer or probe sequences or in the amplicon. With our primetime tool that I mentioned at the beginning, it is pre-designed, and since it is pre-designed, we do have the time to check for SNP locations across the entire transcriptome. So in this tool, it's for human, mouse, or rat, qPCR designs, either probe-based or intercalating dye-based. All of the primers and probe sequences will not be on any SNP locations. I don't believe that this tool checks for SNP locations within the actual amplicon. It just makes sure that the primer and probes do not lay down on those, since that really reduces the efficiency of your assay. But if you didn't want any SNPs within your amplicon, you would probably just need to avoid designing within that region.
Okay. I say we move on to the next session so we can, So the next thing would be denoting exon junctions.
Perfect. That's what I thought. All right. So as I've talked about a few times, because we provide live designs, exon junctions are not taken into consideration to allow fast return of assay results. Exon junction locations can be found on the NCBI website, and then we can manually enter those into the tool. This is my example sequence and some of the exon junctions. I'll actually quickly show you how to find those exon junctions from the NCBI tool as well. So I'm going to switch back to my home page, get everything set up and ready to go. And then we'll hop over to NCBI. So for this one, I'm actually using the same accession number. I'm just going to reset my parameters by clicking on the radio button there. And then we'll switch over to the NCBI tool. So this is what the NCBI website looks like for those of you that aren't familiar with it. Pretty much it's a database for anything related to biotech information, so you can find gene sequences, SNP locations, etc. So what I find the easiest is just to simply enter the accession number that I have. Since I already know it, I can just click enter it at the top there and click search. For this, that is an mRNA sequence, so I'm going to choose this nucleotide option. Once I get to this page, it tells me a lot more information about the gene, organism. I don't really care about most of this information for this specific design, but what I do want to know is the exon locations. So if I begin to scroll down and get into the actual gene information, this is the part, this feature section that shows the actual information. So the gene is 5,225 base pairs, and then it begins to go through all the features of this gene. So the first exon goes to 1061. We can scroll down. The next exon, it goes to 1177, 1339, 1495, etc. This one has quite a few exons, and I didn't want to put all of those in. I was just going to use the first 4. So that's the way that I do pull the exon junctions. If I didn't know the accession number for my gene, I can just type in the abbreviation for that and then begin to go from there. I know I want mouse, so I typically just choose the organism of my interest from the NCBI page. And then from there, I can find the one that I'm interested in. Popping back to this tool, at this point, I don't need any customization besides just entering that the exon junctions that I want, and we specify this as an overlap junction list. So it basically means that the forward or the reverse primer must overlap one of these junctions. And you can actually specify the amount that it must overlap. We default it to 4 bases on the 3' end and 5 bases on the 5' end if that's where it overlaps. So it forces that exon junction to be somewhere within the middle of that primer. So it's just a comma-separated list that I need to enter, so let me get those entered here. One thing that you might be seeing is within this custom target region up here, we do have some color coding. And so those purple dots do show where I specify those exon junctions. One thing that we typically do recommend when designing for exon junctions is increasing the results to return. Essentially, the way that the tool works is it pulls the sequence from NCBI. It has tons and tons and tons of forward and reverse primers to choose from. And based on the parameters that you specify, it starts to exclude certain assays. So basically what it's going to do is it's going to see that I want assays that have to specify one of these 4 locations. So it's going to trash all the other results and just look at those specific assays. From the assays that are left that meet these design criteria, it essentially orders those in what it considers the best at the top. So let's say the 5 assays that it considers best all happen to lie within across junction 1061. We won't necessarily see the assays that lie across the junction for the rest of those. It doesn't mean that the tool didn't see that. It just may be that those results are a little bit lower. So a lot of times when we're doing some of this customization, we do recommend increasing your results to return just to make sure you see enough examples. So clicking Get Assays will bring me to the next page. And if I remember right, my exon locations were 1061, 1177, 1339, and 1449. So if I click Show Custom Target Regions here, it actually shows that again in this section, which is kind of nice if I can't remember the exact numbers that I put in. But you can see that all of those assays do lie across one of the regions that I specified. Some of them cross multiple regions, since those exons were pretty close together. But that's the way that I can double check those results. Is there any more questions you want me to go over, Ian?
Yeah. So there's 2 questions here that I'm going to kind of paraphrase together. So one person was asking about where to find information about the secondary structures and primer dimer formation, and then another person was asking about whether there was a way to avoid secondary structures in the target sequence. And I think that PrimerQuest takes those things into account, correct?
I'm not sure about the target sequence. I'm not sure exactly what that question is asking. Typically, we're more concerned about the primers laying down on that target sequence. And it usually, based on the parameters that we specify, you know, having a GC content of 50%, something around there, usually does get it in regions that don't have a lot of secondary structure. Typically, those regions that have the most secondary structure are a little bit more GC rich. So I don't think it takes that into account for the amplicon region or the target region. I can take a look into that a little bit further. I think you said that the first part of that question was taking into account
Can they find, so really that question is, can they find the information about these assays, like for the hairpin formation or homodimers or whatever, or heterodimers, and find out, you know, like what the scores are? And then this person is also asking, you know, when you get those scores, you know, what's a good or bad score, but that's kind of a different conversation, I think, because that's a different tool. Okay, there
Yeah,
you
that's
go.
kind of with Oligo Analyzer. So essentially, once we have, I can show you this assay information. Once I have that, we already have the option to hairpin, and what that does is it just takes you to our Unifold software, and it starts to give you those hairpin structures. You can also take these sequences and directly go into our Oligo Analyzer tool. I can just take them directly from here. Let me copy this one. Can hop over in here. I'm going to put in the magnesium concentrations and the DNTP concentrations like I specified, and I can start doing the self-dimer, heterodimer, etc. Typically, for all of these, we look at a delta G value. We want something less negative than -9. So this one is -3. We consider that fine, which is why the tool returned that. I'm assuming that's what that question about, but for anything in Oligo Analyzer, delta G less negative than -9 is what we consider pretty safe.
Yep, I think that that's exactly what they wanted to know.
Perfect.
Okay, a few more questions have come in here, but I think we're going to move on to the next section, and I will go over these questions to see what we can cover. Let's see what's next. So, looks like the next thing is designing for pre-existing primers.
Perfect. All right. All right, so let's say in this situation I want to switch from an intercalating dye-based qPCR assay to a probe-based qPCR, and for whatever reason I want to use the same primer sequences. Maybe I ordered a lot of the primer, I have quite a bit left over, or I've optimized using these sequences, I've validated using the sequences. There's a lot of different reasons we would want to keep the same primer sequences, but fortunately we do have the option to just keep those primers and throw a probe between those. So for this example, this is my input sequence, that accession number, and those are the forward and reverse primers that I currently have used. So I can switch back to assay design. I'll get it reset like I've done for a couple of these other examples. Make sure I have enough zeros there. Perfect. And like I said, I need to do a probe base, and so I need to make sure that the first thing that I do is switch it to the design parameter that I'm interested in. Since I am designing for a probe, I need to make sure that there's a section for probe input. Essentially what the tool does is it looks at whatever you have input in this region, and it solves for whatever is not filled in. So in this case, it's going to solve for a probe sequence. If I only put in a forward primer, it's going to solve for the probe and the reverse. Obviously, when we're doing standard designs, there's nothing in there, so it's solving for all three. But it kind of works like an equation, so I need to make sure that the probe-based option is chosen so it knows to design for a probe. At this point, all I have to do is click Get Assays, and it was able to return one for me. It's pretty unlikely that it's going to return more than one probe sequence. Once it finds one that's good, it kind of restricts itself to there. If we also think about it, this only has an amplicon length of 100 base pairs. Obviously, the forward primer is 20, the reverse primer is 20. That restricts it to about 80 bases to work with. As you can see, there's kind of some A regions over here. It tries to make sure it is a little bit of distance away from those primers, and so this was the probe sequence that it returned. I know you guys can't see the PowerPoint in front of you, but I can reassure you that those are the forward and reverse primer sequences that I did input. And I can take questions if there's any more.
Yeah, so I'm kind of looking at the questions that we have right now. I'm wondering, Afton, if you could just take a couple of minutes, since we're getting kind of close to the end here, maybe show some people. We have more than one way to do assay design under the Sci tools. Can you just kind of take them on a quick tour of what's available to them in Sci tools?
Sure. So like prime time, real time.
Yeah,
Okay.
and then maybe show
The
them
one,
what Oligo Analyzer is as well.
sure. So the prime time tool essentially is a library of assay designs. Essentially, you can just type in a gene symbol, specify what species you're working with, and ask the tool to return results. Like we had mentioned before, this one is a pre-design, so we do take into account SNP locations. We are able to blast these sequences to check for cross-reactivity, so it shouldn't cross-react with anything within your species of interest. You are able to customize the size of the assay you want, the dye and the quenchers, the primer and probe ratio, but you can do that with our other tools as well. If I wanted intercalating dye base, I can just switch that configuration at the top here as well, and that will switch these ones at the bottom to just 2 primers and not a probe. So that's the basics of the prime time tool. The real time tool is pretty similar to what we've seen. I can enter an accession number. This one is designed to pull exon locations directly from the NCBI website. So here I can see exactly the exon locations as well. This one doesn't have very many parameters to adjust for. These are the only parameters available, so pretty limited compared to PrimerQuest. But essentially what we usually do is I typically just select all of them and I give the tool the freedom to give me as many results as possible. From here I just click Design Assays. It takes a couple seconds for the results to load for this one. We'll give it just a second. But this one does not blast the primer sequences like the PrimeTime tool does, and it also is not able to check the SNP location since we are doing those live designs. So this one also shows you those forward, reverse, and probe sequences, and up here it shows where it lies down on the transcript. Lastly, hopping over to Oligo Analyzer, I'll get this page refreshed for you. Basically, you can type in any of your primer or probe sequences. This is able to recognize degenerate bases. I'll throw a couple of those in. I don't think a V is a base. There we go. We do need to enter those magnesium and DNTP concentrations. If you're unsure of what anything means, if I wanted to add a phosphorothioate bond, for example, any LNA or methylated bases, the tool is able to recognize those as well. So at this point, I can just click Analyze. There is kind of a range for this one because I did put in those degenerate bases. I put in those Y bases. There is a min and max TM range. So that's the Analyze feature. It shows you all of the information about that specific oligo, the molecular weight, the extinction coefficient, melting temperature. From here, I could do a hairpin structure if I would like. I don't need to retype anything in. Sorry about that. And it does show me the hairpin. I conveniently typed in a pretty decent one. I can tell that because the TM of this one is almost 60 degrees, which does mean it's pretty strong there. Self-dimer will show you those self-dimer values. This one is way more negative than -9, so I would consider that a pretty strong self-dimer.
Oh, can I ask a question on that, Afton, actually, back on that screen?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Can you just quickly say what the dots are versus the bars?
Yep. Yep. So the bars are the base pairs that are taken into account for this delta G number, since it only takes into account base pairs that are in a row. And so these ones will also base pair possibly, but they aren't taken into account for this delta G score.
They have
so
less
if I
influence.
Scroll down, something like this probably is actually going to be a little bit higher than -9, or a little bit more negative than -9, since this will stabilize it a little bit, but it only takes into account the longest stretch in a row. So the same thing goes for a heterodimer check. In this case, it's checking that against another primer. So let me, oops, not a fix. Let me type in another primer sequence there. click calculate. In this one, doesn't have a very strong heterodimer between those. I could also blast directly from here. I can perform a TM mismatch if I do know that there will be some mismatches between the primer and the template sequence, but these first 4 buttons are definitely the most analyzed in this oligoanalyzer software. And if you ever are unsure of what we use to calculate anything in that tool, from the melting temperature with a very long algorithm for that, all the way down to the molecular weights, et cetera, that can just be found in that definitions tab. We do display all that information for you as well.
So at this point, I just want to say there's a pretty decent list of questions that we just didn't have time for. I definitely make an effort to see to it that we follow up with people after the fact with answers to these questions. And also, actually, the way that we've done this webinar, I mean, if people had time, they could check out the session that we have later today, which is at 1 o'clock Central Time. So kind of do the math from there and see if we maybe present some different scenarios. But we've also recorded this, and you can go to the website and watch any of these sections over if there's something you feel like you'd like to spend a little more time with. And Afton's put up some additional resources here. Afton, do you want to just walk people through those really quick?
Sure. I went over most of the additional free sci tools that we have. We do have a quarterly decoded newsletter, and we always have at least one article based on the site tools, this PowerPoint instruction on how to get there. As always, if you have any questions, you can contact our customer care or tech support. The email address is customer@idtdna.com, and we'll get back to you with answers to your questions. If you also have more information or questions on primer design, we have a qPCR application guide. We have a PDF copy online, or you can request a free copy. You can email CustCare if you'd like a free copy of that. But basically, it goes pretty in-depth over qPCR applications, how to set up your qPCR assay, and some more information on the design as well.
I will say we've actually updated the link that's at that primetime page, so now they can request the paper copy from there. It'll take them to a landing page. So
that works.
Okay, so I guess at this point, we have to wrap this up. It's top of the hour, and I just want to thank everyone for their attendance and for the great questions. Like I said, we will be emailing people that didn't get a response and following up with you. The webinar is recorded. It's at our website, www.idtdna.com, and you'll find that under our support tab, and it's also at our YouTube channel along with some other webinars from the past, and that's at www.youtube.com/IDTDNA And this is one of a series of topics that we'll be covering in future webinars on methods such as PCR, qPCR, synthetic biology, other molecular biology topics. And I just want to say thanks again and best of success in your research. Thanks, Afton.